I'm Adam Pascarella, and welcome to episode 21 of The Power of Bold.
From New York City, it's The Power of Bold, the podcast on risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and bold living. Join us as we interview world-class performers, analyze life-changing books, and gather actionable insights to help you achieve your goals. Here's your host, Adam Pascarella.
Hey everyone, thanks for checking out this latest episode of the podcast. As always, I'm really glad that you're here. So it's been 20 episodes since I spoke the first words into the mic in my Upper East Side apartment. Little did I know that I would be recording my 21st episode after having spoken with world-class experts and extracting valuable, actionable insights from my listeners. It goes without saying, but it has been a fabulous experience, and speaking from a personal level, I've learned so much. I'm only going to be ramping up the podcast from here, so I'm super excited for the future. As always, I appreciate your feedback, so if you have any comments or suggestions for future episodes or guests, feel free to email me at adam@thepowerofbold.com. As a celebration of our first 20 episodes, we're going to take a slightly different approach for this episode. Instead of interviewing a guest, I'm going to spend this episode discussing how to actually go about and start a thriving podcast. I've heard from some listeners and friends that they have always wanted to start their own show, yet they don't know where to start. And while it's relatively easy to get up and going, there's a lot to know, from learning how to create your podcast's RSS feed to going out and marketing your new show. I've certainly made mistakes when starting The Power of Bold, so I'd be happy to make sure that you don't make similar mistakes if you're thinking of creating your own podcast. So that's the plan for this episode. But before we get into that, I wanted to share a special gift that we have for you. We went back through our first 20 episodes to date and gathered our top 20 insights for entrepreneurs. It was definitely fun going back through the first 20 episodes to see the growth of the podcast, but it was also fascinating to see all the lessons we've learned from our guests and from studying some classic business and self-help books. To get your free copy of our top 20 insights from our first 20 episodes, visit subscribe.thepowerofbold.com for more information. Okay, with those housekeeping matters out of the way, let's jump into a discussion of how to start a thriving podcast. So like I said, we're going to spend this episode discussing the necessary steps to start a podcast. Before I get into specifics, however, I'd just like to stress that this isn't a bulletproof guide. It's not 100% comprehensive. Yet I wanted to speak about it because, first, I've heard the request from listeners of the show, and second, podcasts have experienced tremendous growth in the past several years. In 2013, about 12% of the U.S. population listened to a podcast. That's now at 44% and growing. I can share some more statistics with you, but it's ultimately safe to say that the podcast industry has grown quickly and is sticking around for the foreseeable future. The question is whether you want to jump on board. Now, while there are many internet resources that can help you get started, I want to share how I created The Power of Bold and some of the mistakes I made so that you can avoid potential landmines down the road. So just to give a quick outline, I'm going to talk about why to start a podcast, how to decide what your show will be about, the minimum tools required, how to create and edit your podcasts, and how to market your show. So let's start with the why. Why should you devote a good amount of your free time to talking into a mic? You likely have your own personal reasons. As for me, I started this podcast back in May of last year for a number of reasons. I first wanted to create something that I would have wanted when I was thinking of leaving my job at a corporate law firm to become an entrepreneur. Second, I wanted to document my experience of leaving my job to start something new. And then I wanted to return to my roots and get behind a microphone, where I would be able to interview interesting people and gather insights that I could share with my listeners. So far, I'm happy with how things have turned out. But if you haven't thought about starting a podcast, I encourage you to at least think about it. There are so many benefits to starting a podcast and releasing your content out into the world. Let's start with the fact that by starting one, you're able to provide immense value to your listeners. I find this to be one of the most rewarding parts. And that value can be many things. It can be career advice, as we often discuss on the show, or it could be an escape from day-to-day life. Whatever it is, it's such a great feeling to be able to make someone's day better. When you get those first couple of emails from your listeners, you'll know what I'm talking about. But even beyond providing value to your audience, there are also some tangential benefits. Simply put, you learn so many skills. You learn how to find interesting guests and book them. You become a better listener, communicator, and interviewer. You learn how to market your podcast and yourself to your audience. The list goes on and on. Also, it goes without saying, but you get to speak with super interesting people. I've been lucky enough to interview world-class performers in business, sports, journalism, and music. It's just a really cool cherry on top of providing all of this value to your listeners. You can essentially ask any question that you want and have an all-star guest share his or her opinion. It's definitely awesome. I tend to think of podcasts as the new business card. It's almost like a book in that sense. Being able to tell professional acquaintances that you have a podcast is a great way to introduce yourself and ultimately market yourself as an expert in whatever your podcast discusses. This could lead to opportunities down the road that you may not be able to envision. So beyond why you should do this, let's talk about one of the most important things, the topic of your show. This may depend on whether you're creating the podcast for yourself or whether you're creating it on behalf of your job or company. But if you're creating it for yourself, you're probably going to select your topic based on some passion you have, and that's perfectly acceptable. You don't absolutely have to do any market research, although it's highly recommended for reasons I'll explain in a little bit. But disregarding that, I think that you'll be more likely to achieve success, however you define it, if you're passionate about what you're talking about. Somewhat associated with passion, I think it's better if you're not starting from scratch in your subject area. You may have just started getting interested in programming, for instance, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting a podcast about it if you're brand new. It's pretty intuitive. Starting off, your audience likely isn't going to know much about you or trust you. If you can come off as someone that is credible and someone who knows what they're talking about, you increase the chances that your audience members stick around. Next, it's just easier to speak about things that you're familiar with. You'll have better interviews with guests and will generally make more compelling content. By talking about your passion, I also think you'll have more fun doing it. For as easy as it is to simply start a podcast, it takes a lot of time to market it and spread the word about your work. It can sometimes be a grind, and the more that you actually enjoy creating your content, the more enthused you'll be to tell people about it. You'll be more inspired to create awesome episodes versus simply going through the motions to put episodes out there. Now, there's also the format of the show. As you know from the power of bold, we mostly focus on interviews with high-performing individuals. It's pretty simple. I give a brief intro, play the recorded interview, and then wrap up the episode. On some episodes, like this one, I dig deeper into a topic or review a book that has meant a lot to me. This works for me and I enjoy listening to podcasts like this. That said, there are other podcasts out there, like Serial, that take a more narrative structure for each episode. Those type of shows, however, take more work on the editing side. Ultimately, you'll just have to determine for yourself how you want your show to be formatted, whether that's a simple interview approach or something more involved. Finally, let's talk about market research. I think it's a good idea to look at the other podcasts out there within your niche, whether that's making a quick list of your competitors or even listening to an episode of each. The consumer is lucky in that there is a ton of good content out there for whatever they're interested in. It's not entirely good news for us, because you have to convince listeners to not only listen to a podcast over something else, but to listen to your podcast compared to others in your niche. It's not easy. So before you get started with your first episode, think about how you're going to separate your podcast from your competitors. It could be the fact that you plan to first speak about a discreetly defined niche, and then, once you obtain more listeners, expand out from there. It could be the fact that it's you or your co-host's personality, humor, or intelligence that will captivate listeners more than other podcasts. You may project that you have more resources than competitors, and will be able to quickly find listeners through Facebook ads or something similar. Or it could be a combination of the above or some other factor. Whatever it is, it's worth thinking about how you're not only going to differentiate your podcast, but whether you have any competitive advantages as you proceed on this journey. Doing this thinking now may save you some headaches down the road. One more thing. Let's talk about the name. This is something that I struggled with. I spent a good amount of time thinking of potential names of this podcast, and I tracked everything in a Google Sheet. There are a variety of resources on the internet to help guide you through thinking of a name. But beyond that, I really like namecheck.com. That's NAMECHK.com. It's a website that checks domains and hundreds of websites on the internet, including social media sites, to see if your favorite name is taken. I would absolutely check this website before deciding on a name for your podcast. Okay, we've talked about why you should do this and how you should start thinking about the content of your show. Let's now discuss some of the tools that you'll need to get started. It's actually super easy to get started with a podcast, which is part of the reason why there are so many out there. If you're looking to start out with a bare bones setup, you'll need a computer, editing software, and a place to host your podcast. That's it. As far as the computer, essentially any functioning computer will do, laptop or desktop. Your computer will contain speakers that can capture audio, or you can use some headphones that have a mic, like Apple's headphones. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, because your audio quality will be subpar. A specific podcasting mic really helps your sound quality, and luckily, you can find some affordable ones on Amazon. I personally use a Blue Snowball USB microphone, which goes for about $70. It's extremely easy to set up. All you do is plug it into your computer, and you're essentially ready to go. On a separate point, I'll place a link to all of my recommendations in the show notes. I'm not receiving any compensation for my recommendations. They are simply what I genuinely prefer. As for my editing software, I use Apple's GarageBand. While it's free, it does take some time to get used to. Luckily, there are a bunch of tutorials on YouTube and elsewhere on the internet so that you can get started. There are other alternatives out there, so you don't have to stay with GarageBand. That said, it is a good option if you have a Mac and if you want to save on costs. Finally, you'll need a place to host your podcast. You may think that you individually upload your finished episodes to podcast directories like iTunes, but that's actually incorrect. Instead, you upload your finished episodes to your podcast host, and then the host releases your episodes to podcast directories like iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. I use Libsyn, Libsyn, which has hosted and published podcasts since 2004. It's a reliable resource, and I found that they have great customer support. That said, you don't necessarily have to stick with Libsyn, as some other hosting companies include Blueberry, Podbean, and Spreaker. Hosting plans for Libsyn start as low as $5 per month, but you'll want to check the fine print for all of these hosting companies. These hosting companies will guide you on how to ensure that your RSS feed is set up correctly, and that your podcast is going to as many podcast directories as possible. As far as additional tools, you can always buy more expensive hardware, like better mics, a mic stand, a mic isolation shield, and other things. You may also want to consider setting up your own website as well, as it can be used to host your show notes and can be a place where you can drive traffic from your podcast. The sky really is the limit, depending on your budget and the amount of time that you want to put into your podcast. But as for my personal recommendation, shoot for a computer, external podcasting mic, editing software, and a hosting plan with a podcast hosting company. Now, let's move on to creating your first couple of episodes. And I said that for a reason. The consensus is that you shouldn't just release one episode when you're starting out. At a minimum, you should release 3 episodes. This is for a number of reasons, including the fact that your podcast is more likely to get discovered if you have more than one episode, and that, in the best case scenario, your fans love your first episodes and don't have to wait for additional episodes. So shoot for releasing at least 3 episodes at the beginning. Beyond that, I'd likely spend the first part of your first episode explaining who you are, what your podcast is about, and what you're looking to accomplish. This will undoubtedly change as you create more content, but it's good to offer this explanation to your audience at the beginning. As for the content of your first couple of episodes, it's going to vary depending on your particular podcast. But if you can somehow get a big interview, a big get, it may increase the odds that your podcast will stand out. Now granted, it's difficult to book well-known guests if you don't have a track record, and especially if you're starting off by yourself. So perhaps think about going through your network and seeing if you can find a guest that can make some waves. It's hard, but it's not impossible. Ultimately, you don't need a high-profile guest to start. I didn't. But it can make life easier for you, especially in terms of getting your name out there and gathering audience momentum. And speaking of guests, if you're going to consistently have guests on your show, you need to come up with some way to have a reliable stream of guests so that you aren't stuck in a drought. Booking guests takes time, and the more high-profile the guest, the more time you'll need to book them. Unfortunately, this just takes time, and I could spend a whole episode talking about how to find and source guests. But just for a few pointers, I would suggest 1. Focusing on guests within your network. 2. When pitching, try to focus on similarities you have with the guest, whether it's a friend, whether you attended the same college, etc. And 3. Explain how your show will offer value to them. Once you start having guests on your show, it becomes easier to book new guests, since the prior guests on your show provide social proof. The metaphorical pinwheel, so to speak, starts turning faster and faster. It's still not easy though, so recognize that you'll be spending a lot of time on this as you build up your podcast. Now, there are also some things to think about for each episode that you produce. For starters, I'd highly recommend opening and or closing your episodes by telling your listeners to subscribe to your podcast and leave a review on iTunes or Google Play. You'll want to focus on getting subscribers from your first episode, and one of the best ways to ensure consistent growth is for your listeners to give you 5-star reviews. The more you receive, the more likely that you'll get noticed by new listeners and even Apple, which could promote you through its new and noteworthy list. This is something that you don't want to ignore. I also recommend that you find some music to introduce and close out each episode. Importantly, you're going to need to purchase a license for the music so that it's quote-unquote pod safe. There's a ton of music out there for you to browse. I recently changed my intro and outro music, but I bought both the prior and current versions on a website called pond5.com. That's 5 the number, not 5 spelled out. This isn't the only choice though, so feel free to explore as much as you want. Longtime listeners of the show also may have noticed that I added an intro and outro voiceover as well. This is optional for starting out, but I think it sounds more professional. I found my voiceover artist on Fiverr.com, and it was pretty affordable. You could also look to other freelance sites like Upwork.com, or look to a website that focuses exclusively on professional voiceovers, although those fees may be much higher. On the technical front, there are a few things I do to make my podcast sound better. As you know, I include sound effects to transition between certain segments of each episode. You can find free sound effects on websites like soundboard.com or freesound.org. I think they provide additional color to your episodes and make them sound more professional. When I'm finished recording and editing an episode, I upload each episode to auphonic.com. That's AUPHONIC.com. Auphonic cleans up your audio and makes your podcast episodes sound cleaner. You're allocated a free amount of audio processing time per month, but if you need more, it's available for purchase. I really recommend using Auphonic for each episode, even if you have to pay to purchase more audio processing time. If you really want to make your podcast sound great, you can hire a freelance professional to clean up your episodes. This is something that I haven't done yet, but you may find it attractive if you don't want to edit your own episodes. Again, going to a freelance marketplace like Fiverr or Upwork will likely be a good way to start. Once your episodes are complete and you've run the audio through Auphonic, you're going to upload them to your podcast host. When uploading your first episode, your podcast host will help you set up your RSS feed, and will ensure that your episodes are on podcast directories like iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, and others. You'll have to provide a brief summary of your show, along with some other things, but your podcast host will be able to provide more information. Along with this, you'll need a logo. Again, you can go the professional route or do it yourself. If you opt to do it yourself, as I did, you can create a simple logo on a design website like canva.com, canva.com. There's one more thing here. That is show notes. They're kind of a pain to do, but it's part of providing value to your audience. The show notes for my podcast include things like book recommendations and further information about my guests. But you can take this wherever you want and can make it as detailed as you want. I don't think you can ignore show notes, however, so make sure that you create at least something for each episode. So now we've arrived at one of the most important parts of this process. You've created your episodes and have released them out into the world. It's quite an accomplishment, and you should be really pleased with yourself. Many people think about doing something like this, but few take action. That said, recording and releasing your episodes is just half the battle. The other half is marketing your podcast and ensuring that you actually have listeners. Arguably, this is tougher than making your show or episodes themselves. Like I said earlier, the consumer has an unbelievable number of choices, not only within the podcast market, but in the market of how to spend their free time. You need to somehow break through this in order to grow your podcast. It isn't easy, and it's something that I think about a lot. So considering all of this, how do you get started? There are a couple basic things. First, distribution is key. You're going to want to be on as many podcast directories as possible. Sure, iTunes and Google Play are the most important, but there's no disincentive to make sure that your podcast is found on podcast directories other than those. So with that said, some of the can't-miss directories include Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, SoundCloud, and Overcast. There are others out there, and your podcast host can help you submit your RSS feed to these directories. Sometimes you'll have to submit your RSS feed directly, but that's very easy to do. Another thing that I would highly recommend is uploading the audio recording of your episodes to YouTube. YouTube is the second largest search engine on the internet, and is a great way to expand the word about your podcast. You don't necessarily need to record video of yourself interviewing guests, although it's a good idea. You can simply just take your MP3 file and use your logo as a still image for your video. I use Apple's iMovie to make all of my YouTube videos, but you can use any video editing software that you'd like. Once I'm finished, I simply upload the video episode to YouTube, add appropriate tags and links to my website, and then click Submit. It's easy to do and increases the odds that you'll get discovered by new fans. So beyond pure distribution, you're going to want to have some presence on social media. At a minimum, we're talking Facebook and Twitter, but Instagram and Pinterest are also helpful. From there, it's all about engagement. This is really a full-time job, and admittedly, I still have things to learn. But you have to learn how to capitalize on hashtags, reach out to so-called influencers and see if they can vouch for you, and interact with your fans. I also create promotional images on Canva, which can include some great quotes from the conversation and banner images to put on my Facebook and Twitter pages. And when I'm feeling really ambitious, I post blogs on Medium.com that summarize the top insights from the episode and direct interested readers to check it out. If you'd like to learn more about this, I'd recommend looking at Gary Vaynerchuk articles and videos. You can also choose to purchase Facebook ads or something similar, and this has been an effective strategy for some people. If you're looking to minimize costs and bootstrap your podcast, you can, but recognize that this may take longer than if you were buying listeners through social media advertising. Also, on a related point, I found Reddit to be a great source to not only spread the word about your podcast, but to also receive feedback on everything from sourcing guests to the sound quality of your podcast. However, you want to practice proper Reddit and not be too self-promotional. Make sure that you're providing value to the community instead of solely asking for feedback or favors. Because if you do the latter, you may get warned or even banned from some subreddits. Provide value first, and then you'll get value in return. Just a few more points on marketing. First, I think it's important to provide fairly comprehensive summaries of each episode. As you see for each Power of Bold episode, I describe many of the topics discussed in each episode, and provide time codes so listeners, if they wish, can browse through the episode to find the parts that matter most to them. I also like to provide transcripts for each episode. I didn't do it in the beginning, but I do for each episode now. I think it's just another way of providing value to the listener. Some people don't have time to listen to a 45-50-minute episode, and they appreciate being able to get to the crux of the discussion by reading a transcript. You likely want to find a freelancer to do this, as creating a transcript for a nearly hour-long episode can take a long time. Beyond those things, it's also a good idea to create an email list for your podcast. I was a little late to the ball with this one, and we could have an entirely separate episode on email marketing. Putting that aside, building an email list is a great way to further engage with your audience, offering supplemental value to that which is in your podcast episodes. Once your podcast gets bigger, you can send exclusive content to members of your list, and perhaps, eventually, offer paid products. Ultimately, a good way to get people to subscribe to your list is to provide immediate value, often some item that subscribers can get for free. And that's exactly what I'm doing with my list, as I said at the beginning of the episode. While I know this is a lot of work, an email list, while difficult at first, may pay off massive dividends down the road. If you want to get started creating an email list, you can look to services like MailChimp or MailerLite. To conclude this final section, I'd briefly like to talk about monetization. To be totally upfront, I don't yet monetize this podcast. I wanted to wait until I had a large enough audience, and consequently, I've been focusing on finding more and more listeners. That said, monetization isn't impossible at the early stages, especially if you have a built-in audience that is eagerly awaiting your first episode. But I feel that for the vast majority of people starting up, it's better to wait until you achieve some critical mass before pursuing advertising and other monetization opportunities. The choice obviously is up to you. So there you have it. That is a very brief primer into how to start a podcast. Like I said at the jump, it's impossible to deliver a comprehensive guide in one episode, so I tried to hit on some of the key points and some of the key mistakes that I made when starting the Power of Bold. In the grand scheme of things, it's easy to get up and get started, but it's another thing to become listed on the iTunes top podcast charts. But if you enjoy what you're doing and you're passionate about creating content, the odds of your success will increase. In the show notes, I'm also going to include several resources that were really helpful when I started this podcast, including the resources mentioned throughout this episode, in articles and videos from Tim Ferriss and Pat Flynn. I can't wait to hear about what all of you start. And if you'd like to learn more about how to start a podcast, or if you have any questions about the process, you can always reach out directly to me. Feel free to email adam@thepowerofbold.com. I'd be happy to help. That's it for this episode of The Power of Bold. Like I said earlier, I want to thank you for tuning into our first 20 episodes. It has been a terrific experience, and I can't wait to see what the next 20 bring. Until next time, take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Power of Bold. For show notes and a transcript of this episode, visit thepowerofbold.com. Feel free to get in touch by visiting our Facebook and Twitter pages. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Google Play. We'll see you next time.